This is Mike Consol with Julie Miller, Dr. Julie Miller. We are writing coaches, and this month's subject has to do with how to find your writer's voice. Julie, why don't you kick things off?
You know, Michael, this is a really good topic because it's just very interesting. Right now, I'm working with a construction company, and they write technical material as well as emails to clients. And it's interesting, even they have had trouble finding that voice, that conversational tone, even when you're writing proposals that connect you with the reader. And working on, gee, what is the voice of our company? How would we view ourselves? Are we professional? Are we stilted? And finding that is difficult. So it's a marvelous topic to begin with.
So, when you're talking about finding your writer's voice, certainly it tends to be conversational. I think there's a little more to it than that. I think you would agree. And I'm going to offer up a quote from Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, who is one of my favorite journalists of all time. He was just a tremendous reporter. He wrote great books. And this is what he had to say, and I quote, "This above all, find your own voice. The most satisfying compliment a reader can pay is to tell me that he or she feels personally addressed. Think of your own favorite authors and see if that isn't precisely one of the things that engages you, often at first without your even noticing it." End quote. And I want to go back to that little snippet where he says that he or she, the reader, feels personally addressed. I think that is so potent and so important that the writer is speaking to me, because if you feel like you're part of a group when somebody is writing to you, now this doesn't exactly tell you how to get there, but when you feel like you're just part of a group, a number of people that author is talking to versus this person's talking right across the table to me, it makes a huge difference. Now, I'll give an example also of, so how do you find your voice? Well, there's a lot of different pieces of advice, and Dr. Julie Miller will weigh in here as well. But I can tell you how one author did it. I'm speaking of Dominic Dunn, another journalist who wrote some terrific books. He wrote some great novels. One of my favorite things he wrote is called An Inconvenient Woman, which was also made into a movie. Now, the thing that he did, though, after he was a Hollywood guy, he ended up getting sideways with a lot of people, the wrong people. He ended up basically falling out with the Hollywood set. So he just hit the road. He hit the road and was traveling around. He was trying to find himself. He was quite depressed. He ended up going to Oregon, finding a cabin in Oregon where he thought, I'm just going to sit in this cabin and I'm going to write. And he wrote and he wrote and he wrote hours a day. Nothing in particular it wasn't that he was working on a particular project. He just would find a subject to write about. And he wrote until he realized that his voice was emerging. Previous to that, he was writing, he was putting words on paper, he was constructing sentences, he was putting a logical flow together. But it took hours and hours of practice, of actual writing, before he realized, this is my voice. It has finally emerged, and this is how I am going to be speaking to my readership. And of course, he was a huge hit. His books became bestsellers, and he was a consistent writer for Vanity Fair magazine, one of the best written magazines out there. So that's one man's story. And then again, I don't want to be quoting just dead white men like Dominic Dunn and Christopher Hitchens, but it's the people who came before us whose shoulders we stand on. And that's a story there that can be informative, because I think one of the issues, Julie, is that so often people don't put in the time necessary to find their voice.
Well, you're so right. And Mike, you're really talking on so many levels that are so important. First of all, the idea that the reader is the central figure in your writing. And if you aren't writing to that reader, it's just as you said, there's no connection. This isn't about me, etc. And that plays out everything from sales writing, where you're doing sales, to ads, to proposals, to email, to anything, that if you aren't writing an authentic voice to the reader, they're a turnoff. And part of that is figuring out what that reader needs from you to solve his or her problem, or want a solution. Or in the case of journalism, getting us the facts to help us make decisions intelligently.
Well, one of the examples you brought up was, I think, a construction company, and they were trying to get some clarity on, what are we going to sound like? How are we going to do this? And one of the things that I learned years ago, I forget who wrote about it, but if you look at most websites, they talk about themselves. They don't talk to you. They don't speak in the you. They speak in the we. And basically saying, we do this and we do that, and we're capable of this and we're capable of that. Well, if you're a reader of a website, and this would apply to sales copy, marketing brochures, you name it, you need to speak to the person who you're writing to, the customer. When you're talking about business writing, you certainly want to speak to the customer, because if the customer is not being addressed, the customer is going to lose interest, or just basically subliminally. It's not even a conscious thought. Subliminally, they're not talking to me. They're talking about themselves. You don't get anywhere by just talking about yourself unless you're telling some kind of story. Exactly. Otherwise, you really need to address the customer or the prospective customer. That's the only way you're going to penetrate.
Exactly. And one of the things I always tell writers, one of the ways to check if you're speaking to the reader or about yourself is, let's just go back to the proposal idea I presented, is you take two different colored pens, and you go through the document and you circle every time you talk about yourself, our, we, the company name, our name, all of that. And how many times with another colored pen you mention the client, his or her name, the company name, and what you're going to do for them. And I've seen more business lost when folks only focus on, this is all the wonderful things we do, aren't we wonderful, rather than our wonderfulness will help you achieve success.
Exactly. And that's a great exercise that you just outlined there, where you circle the references to the customer versus yourselves. Self-referential copy is not effective copy, except in rare instances, again, when you're telling a story, some kind of anecdote that speaks to that reader. But we're not trying. I hope we're not sounding to you like finding your own voice is a simple matter. It takes work. It takes time. It takes hard work. It comes naturally to some people. It doesn't come naturally to most people, even professional writers. So put in the work, take the time. You can simply set aside some time each day. It doesn't have to be huge blocks of time, but you will start to build momentum and think in terms of what Julie and I are saying in each piece of copyright, even if it's an email. A simple email, you're writing to somebody, make sure that you're selecting words and phrases that are speaking to the reader, where the recipient is going to say, that is meant to me. They're speaking directly to me.
Mike, if we reflect back on a couple of our podcasts where we've talked about where writers get themselves in trouble, I go back to when this COVID thing first started and how these senior leaders got themselves in trouble by writing to their employees and saying, this is how it's going to be, pilgrims, kind of. And here's the rules. Never saying, we feel your pain. We know how difficult this is. You have kids at home. None of that. And they got huge pushback, many complaints, reports to HR about the lack of empathy of not writing to them.
Yes. I'll throw one more example out there because we're right in the midst of it right now, a presidential campaign, and not just presidential, but a political election season. We're heading up towards November 3rd, 2020. But this what I'm about to say has nothing to do necessarily with you being in election season. But who are the effective politicians? They have a simple message.
Correct.
They keep it down to just a few really memorable items, and they talk about you, not themselves. They talk about your issues and how they're going to address those issues. And they get into some specifics when it's necessary. But you can't have a 59-point plan like Mitt Romney had, or who God knows how many point plan that Hillary Clinton had. This is why they lose elections, is because the voters out there saying, what is it? What's the message? And does the message apply to me? And that's high stakes stuff. Same with business.
So there was a noted linguist who said that when Kerry was running against Bush, that one of the reasons Bush won is because he spoke in plain language. And Kerry's speaking style was like the 12th or 14th grade level. And people would scratch their heads. What did this guy just say? Where Bush is, just like you said, simple sentences, very plain language, speaking to them. I thought that was kind of an interesting review.
And there's that the Know Your Audience thing, which is a podcast that we did previously. You can go back and check that one out. But our time is up. So, Julie, always great collaborating with you, and we will do this again next month.
Absolutely. Thank you.